Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started with the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasterarea@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject but you're not sure if it qualifies, please feel free to message me and I can approve one way or the other. The subject of this particular episode was chosen by Hunter, and I'd like to thank them for the request and for the donation. If you'd still like to help support the podcast, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or wherever else that you might listen to me. And as always, these sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode include the New York Times article Barge Pilot Blamed in Fatal Amtrak Wreck, a Los Angeles Times article entitled No Criminal Liability is Found in Bayou Derailment, the Seconds from Disaster episode The Wreck of the Sunset Limited, the Forensic Files episode Visibility Zero, the Rail Disasters YouTube channel video on this particular crash, the NTSB report about the crash, and an article by the Mobile Press Register about how they responded to the accident. With all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 259, The Big Bayou Canot Rail Disaster. September 22nd, 1993. 47 deceased, 103 injured. I've been having trouble sleeping the last few years. It used to be that I could fall asleep anywhere, but now getting to sleep is a struggle. A pillow between my legs, a stuffed animal tucked under my chin, a fan pointed at my feet, a mask over my eyes, and even then, sometimes only a weed gummy can truly do the trick and knock me out. But among the long list of things I do to shove myself into slumber, one of them is finding a nice long video on YouTube of some sort of calming, repetitive noise. Heavy winds, a strong thunderstorm, a big old winter blizzard. A lot of times I'll turn to videos where a car drives through the city or on the highway in the rain, and I pretend I'm still a little girl napping in the back seat as we drive home from Grandma's. There's another one that works equally well, the steady, rhythmic, rolling sounds of a train traveling across the country. I'm sure the real experience isn't quite as comforting, but there's a certain romantic quality to riding on a train and watching the world pass by. Of course, much like so many other experiences on this podcast, all of that can end in a single disastrous moment. Mobile, Alabama is the fourth most populous city in the state, tucked into the bay, splitting the short panhandle at the southernmost part of Alabama. The waters of Mobile Bay lap against the eastern edges of the city it shares a name with, and Mobile runs a busy port from its shores. Muddy rivers and creeks wriggle their way north to the east of Mobile through the delta there, looking in satellite images like a cluster of brown snakes tangled on someone's green lawn. One of those tributaries is the Big Bayou Canot, a marshy area closed to commercial traffic. Now, as I understand this, I went to go make sure I was pronouncing this correctly, and when you look it up on YouTube, it tells you to say canot, because it's giving you the French pronunciation, but in every documentary I watched, they said Canot. So I'm saying Canot, because apparently that's how the locals say it. Traveling up the Mobile River from the busy ports to the south, a boat's first complication, if you wanted to call it that, would be reaching 12 Mile Island. 12 Mile Island sits in the middle of the river, shaped like a simple leaf, with the river branching off to the left and right around it. If you stick to the right, you'll follow the Mobile River along the island's east side and easily continue north on the river. Basically, it looks like you have this river and it's kind of wide, and then in the middle, just this like zit pops up out of nowhere in the middle, and it kind of comes up through the water, and you have this island, and the river diverts around it and then comes back together at the top of 12 Mile Island. But if you were to go to your left around 12 Mile Island, you might find yourself getting a little lost if you didn't have a map, a compass, a working radar. If the light were bad, if it was nighttime, if the weather was bad, all of that could make this section of the Mobile River a complicated ride, she said, foreshadowing future events. Bayou Sarah and Black Creek split off on the first left, an exit of sorts which goes underneath one of the many bridges in the area, this one carrying railroad tracks. Now, some of these bridges are swing bridges, which is where the center will turn, not like open like a door, more like swing like a revolving door. So, like a door, but a revolving door, I guess. And so some of them in the middle will do that. This bridge, the bridge that's by Bayou Sarah, will do that. And the bridge across the Mobile River, like 14 miles up. So 2 miles past 12 Mile River. They will do that as well. A short distance up on the left, when you're going past 12 Mile Island, on the left, is another tributary under another bridge for the same tracks. After this, you would reach the point at the northern edge of 12 Mile Island where the two branches of the Mobile River converge once again. However, the river is not one lane here. The Mobile River, wider and busier, curves off to the right as you look ahead. But there is another river, this one slightly narrower, which goes off to the left. This is the Big Bayou Canot, which you are not allowed to go down if you're on a boat or something along those lines. Again, if you were unfamiliar with this area and the visibility wasn't great, hint, hint, it wouldn't be hard to accidentally follow the Big Bayou Canot instead of the Mobile River. You have to picture the top of 12 Mile Island as being like if you put your wrists together, to put your hands together to pray, and you open your hands up, and only your wrists are together. That bottom part where your wrists are together, that little point, that would be the top of 12 Mile Island. Your right hand would be the Mobile River, and then the left hand is the Big Bayou Canot. Farther up the Big Bayou than the previous two left turns is yet another train crossing for the same rail line. It's going straight across this bayou and the tributaries and rivers that go through it. And of course they wind everywhere, so it's just constantly going over these tributaries. The line also crosses the Mobile River farther to the east. So further up along the line, you get to that bridge on the Mobile River. This particular rail bridge sits about 10 miles northeast of Mobile, the one that's on the Big Bayou. The southernmost part of the bridge is covered with trusses, with the top half open. So that southern half, if you're coming from Mobile and you're heading across that river, the first half of the bridge has one of those truss structures across the top, and then the rest of the bridge is wide open. It's just the tracks going across, maybe a little railing, but it's open to the air, while the front part is the truss section. It is, let's see here. The Big Bayou, I've lost my place. Big Bayou ripples back and forth like a ribbon whipping through the air in the wind. So if you keep going down that river, if you manage to get past that bridge and go up that river, it just sort of starts wriggling and get really narrow. But if you keep going up it, it's easy enough to get back on the Mobile River, so long as you stick to the right as you should have done from the start. The Big Bayou diverts off into the Mobile River just before Dead Lake, which looks less like a lake and more like the Big Bayou dwindling down to a little creek and then to nothing at all. It looks like the tail of a snake, basically. It just kind of goes narrower and narrower until there's nothing left. Our story starts today 3 days prior to the events of this episode, when the Sunset Limited Amtrak Superline Train Number 2 departed from Los Angeles, heading towards Miami. Over the course of the cross-country trip, it would drop passengers off, pick new ones up, and bring aboard fuel and supplies at around 50 different stops. The Sunset Limited was one of the first cross-country trains in the U.S. with a Vista car with larger windows on the second floor, so you could sit and enjoy the scenery as it goes by. You know, you could just kind of relax, watch like the desert go by, Texas, all of that. It's a really great ride, you know, a nice few days that you can spend on the rails going from one coast to the other to see the southern United States from a train instead of a car. As Tuesday, September 21st, 1993, tumbled past midnight and became Wednesday, the Sunset Limited had just departed from New Orleans, albeit a little late. The train was supposed to leave New Orleans at 11 p.m. that night, but aside from loading on passengers and 5,800 gallons of diesel fuel, the train also needed the air conditioning and one of the toilets fixed. As I understand it, the air conditioners needed to be fixed in like multiple cars, but the toilet it was just one toilet. They just needed to fix that. It took them about a half an hour to get all of this done and fixed. It only took the train 3 hours to reach Mobile after they would leave New Orleans, 34 minutes late. You have to picture, you're on this train, you're trying to sleep, it's the middle of the night, you're stopped in New Orleans, they're banging things around, trying to fix this, that, and the other thing. You finally start going, and then it takes 3 hours to get to Mobile. You get nice, you get settled, and then the train stops in Mobile, and you have another, people getting on, people getting off. So it takes 3 hours to get there. Once they get there, they're only there for about 3 minutes, just to kind of pick people up, drop people off, that sort of a thing. When it left Mobile at 2:33 a.m. with somewhere around 220 people on board, most of those on board were asleep, including a number of the crew. The train would follow the tracks out of Mobile to the northeast, although through the Marshy Delta as it headed towards Miami. So you kind of have to follow those train tracks, and they go straight northeast, basically. Just a nice, pretty straight line when you're going right out of Mobile. Meanwhile, a tugboat by the name of the Movilla was in the middle of pushing a flotilla of barges up the Mobile River to Tuscaloosa, which is about 225 miles away from Mobile up the river. The Warrior and Gulf Navigation Company owned or operated the Movilla, and so it was their responsibility to make sure their crews were properly staffed and trained. That night, the Movilla and her crew of 4 would be pushing 6 barges up the Mobile River in a wired-together flotilla, headed to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The barges would be carrying all sorts of heavy cargo: large slabs of steel, iron pellets, cement, coke, the coal product, not the soda. And they were all arranged in 2 rows of 3. So you had 3 barges in the front, and then 3 barges in the middle, and then the Movilla in the back. Between the boat and the barges, the entire flotilla was 490 feet long and 100 feet wide. So you basically have these 6 pretty big barges that are in front of this, and then this little boat in the back just pushing them along. The Movilla's captain, Andrew Stabler, ended his command that night at about 11:30, heading to his bunk to sleep. He settles in, gets relaxed, watches a little TV, and then he goes to bed about midnight. This leaves the Movilla under the charge of pilot Willie Odom. Now, Odom did not have nearly 2 decades of experience like Captain Stabler did at being on the river and working on the river, but he had been working in the industry for a while, and he'd recently gotten his pilot's license. It was a big achievement for him. That evening on the Mobile River, fog crawled over the water and made visibility a nightmare. The National Weather Service hadn't predicted fog for the area for that night, but it could come on pretty quick in the marshes around Mobile. It really wasn't unusual for, the National Weather Service to, not predict fog and for there to be fog. It just happened a lot. In the wheelhouse at about 2:15 a.m., in the wheelhouse of the Movilla, Pilot Odom radioed the Thomas McCabe, another towboat about a half a mile ahead of the Movilla. The Movilla had been able to see the rear lights of the Thomas McCabe until it turned near Bayou Sarah. Now it was just past 12 Mile Island while the Movilla was still heading their way. So Willie Odom asks the Thomas McCabe, how is the fog up ahead? How bad is it? The captain of the Thomas McCabe, was Jeff Williams, I believe, told Odom it was, quote, shut out, meaning visibility was down to 0 where he was. As Odom and the Movilla reached the northern tip of 12 Mile Island, the fog grew so dense, visibility dropped like a rock for Odom as well. He could barely see the barges in the front row of the flotilla, much less what was past that. With the fog as bad as it was, Odom kept the Movilla moving as close to the left-hand banks of the river as he dared, and even then at a couple of knots, so at most like 3 miles per hour, 4 kilometers per hour. He's not going very fast. He's basically just crawling along. At the time, Odom thought he was still on the Mobile River, passing through 13 Mile Marsh and the 14 Mile Railroad Bridge, as those working the river called it. It did have a different name. It was sort of like the Mobile River Railroad Bridge or something along those lines, but I just found it funny because it's a lot easier to tell people how things are situated when they're all named 12 Mile, 13 Mile, 14 Mile. So, yeah, that gives you some idea of where everything is. The Movilla crept along the river as Odom peered through the darkness and the fog, attempting to spot a tree he knew was located around the area. Big, sturdy, and strong enough to secure 6 heavy barges and the Movilla for the rest of the night. We're talking about a marshy, swampy area. There's not a lot of big trees, big, strong trees like that, so you really have to look to find something that can hold that. He and a deckhand tried to tie off at least twice on 2 different trees, but the flotilla was simply too heavy. They had to keep going and keep looking for something that could keep them in place. Meanwhile, as Willie Odom searched for a spot to park the Movilla and the flotilla until the fog cleared, traffic on the bridge over the Big Bayou Canot continued apace. At 2:43 a.m., a freight train heading south towards Mobile passed over the bridge without incident. On the other side of the river, heading toward it, the Sunset Limited was going at around 72 miles per hour, or 116 kilometers per hour. As far as the people on board the Sunset Limited knew, the crew, the conductor, all of that, it was clear sailing up ahead and there was no need to slow down. They could keep going. They weren't getting any sort of warnings, any sort of radio information, anything like that. On the river, Odom continued to look for a place to moor the Movilla. He could see something on the radar up on the river ahead, but he couldn't tell what it was. Again, he radioed the Thomas McCabe, this time to ask if there was a boat on the river between the 2 towboats that he didn't know about. The captain of the McCabe informed him that there was not. At this point, Odom made the decision to put the Movilla in reverse. He's like, okay, I don't know what that is ahead. I can't keep going like this. He puts the Movilla in reverse and starts to try and back up with the barges. Now, keep in mind, they're going, they're still going forward, and to put it in reverse, it kind of goes forward a little bit before you can dig your heels in and pull back. So that's kind of what's happening here. He didn't know what was ahead of him. It was too foggy to take any chances. He puts on the brakes and kind of starts to reverse, and it was unfortunately too late to change what was about to happen. At 2:45 a.m., the barges hit something. What? Willie Odom could not tell, but he might have been able to see the barges in the row closest to the Movilla banging and bobbing together in the river. Clearly, the ones in front had hit something, the barges behind them had hit them, and so they kind of rattled around. Like if you've got like a bowl full of cereal you haven't put milk in yet, you kind of shake it around, it just rattles in there, and it's like that. The bump was certainly felt by everyone on the Movilla, enough to wake up Captain Stabler and have him coming to the wheelhouse. But still, the bump didn't feel as though they'd hit something significant. Maybe it was a rock in the water or a submerged log. Like, it didn't really feel that serious. What Willie Odom and the rest of the crew didn't yet know was that the barges the Movilla was pushing had banged into the base of one of the support piers for the railroad bridge over the Big Bayou Canot. The barges clattered together from the jolt, bumping this way and that in the water. The push nudged one of the bridge's girders 38 inches out of alignment. Essentially, the eastern side of the bridge looked as though a giant had elbowed into it and pushed it out of the way a little bit. You kind of knock something out of your way if it's, you kind of knock somebody aside, a little bit with your elbow when you're trying to make space or something like that. That's what it looked like. It looked like somebody had nudged the train tracks just a little bit over. But they were clearly not in line with the tracks under the trestle, which they should have been. To the south, the Sunset Limited continued hurtling toward the bridge. A little bit ahead of the bridge, the train passed a signal on the side of the tracks with two lights, one red, one green. This may seem like I'm talking down to you, but green meant all indications were that the tracks ahead were safe and unblocked, making it okay to continue onward without an overabundance of caution. Red would show up if the tracks had broken, and it meant immediately slowing to around 15 miles per hour or 24 kilometers per hour to watch for a snapped rail. When the Sunset Limited passed by the signal, it was green. This despite the fact the bridge had already been struck at this time. When the Sunset Limited finally reached and sped over the bridge at 2:53 a.m., it did so with no idea of just what the damage ahead of them looked like, or even that there was damage at all. About halfway across the bridge, what should have been continuous straight tracks had shifted, but not snapped, to the train's left. So whoever was at the front of that train looking out, they may have seen it just in a passing second, but they didn't really see it well. Basically, that the tracks ahead, if they could see them at all, the tracks ahead were, moved over. Just a little bit. Like, the ones in the middle were moved over. This left the Sunset Limited plummeting from the bridge into the Big Bayou Canot. First the train's 3 engines, then the barge car, the baggage car, and then the dormitory car and 2 coach cars. The last 4 cars, a coach, the lounge car, the dining car, and a sleeper car, remained on the bridge. So pretty much after that, it didn't pull the rest of the train with it. It kind of broke apart, and all of those cars fell into the river. When the front of the train careened off the bridge, the first engine flew off like a shot, arcing through the air until it landed 240 feet away in the marsh. It basically, shot out and ended up going 45 feet or something like that down into the marsh itself. It was kind of sticking up out of the air. If you've ever seen the sculpture, the Cadillac Ranch sculpture or whatever it's called. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's the one with the cars that are in the ground, like Stonehenge, Carhenge, or whatever it is. It's something kind of like that where they're at that angle. That's exactly what that engine looked like. It was sticking up out of the ground, and it had just driven itself right into the marsh. The gas tanks from the wrecked engines ruptured, spilling diesel into the river. And remember, they refueled in New Orleans, so there are thousands of gallons of diesel spilling into the river. Inside the passenger cars where people had been sleeping through the night, some now found themselves in murky river water, struggling to keep their heads above water and trying to find a way out. And possibly smelling fire. Definitely smelling diesel, because it was all over that water. In one of the passenger cars, the end remained propped up by a girder from the bridge. A former lifeguard was able to get the door next to the girder open and leapt into the water. He urged others to jump out of the train car into the river, where he would make sure to pull them out. Essentially, they were jumping down about a story. So you figure 10 feet, they drop down into the water, they go down. And so the first thing that they do when they go into the water is he reaches down and grabs onto their clothes, or I don't know, maybe their hair or something, and grabs them and hauls them back out again so that they can start swimming and get out of the way and the next person can come out. So he managed to help a lot of people that way. He had urged the people to do that, and once they were in the river, though, they had to swim through diesel-clogged water containing snakes and alligators, trying to swim to an unfamiliar bank in the dark and fog, and some of them actually didn't even try, because it's dark, you can't see where you are, you have no idea, you don't know if you're going to swim to a bank and there's going to be like an alligator there, you have no clue. You don't know if there's going to be snakes, what's going to be going on. I mean, there's snakes in the water, diesel, all of that, but the familiar feels more comfortable than the unfamiliar, and I think in this situation there was probably a lot of people on board that train who were now in the water and thought, well, I'll just cling on to the train and they'll know where to find me. On the Movilla, the crew was still trying to ascertain what they might have struck, with pilot Willie Odom clearly distraught at the possibilities. He'd already gotten the towboat in control of the barges, he heard a whoosh, and then radioed the tender at the 14-mile bridge to see if there were any reports of fire. Now, remember, he still thinks the 14-mile bridge is like ahead of him, that he's still on the Mobile River. And so he thinks that maybe, just maybe, he is seeing some sort of fire ahead of him on the Mobile River. Maybe the Thomas McCabe is on fire. And so he radios to the person, the tender, who is in charge of the swing bridge at 14 Mile Bridge. That bridge can like open up so that, that boats can pass through, and asks him, well, have you seen any fire or anything? Because if they're still on the Mobile River, he should see something, but he doesn't. When a deckhand brought Captain Stabler to the bridge, there was still some confusion about what was going on. Like, Willie Odom sends this deckhand out to get Captain Stabler. While he's doing that, he's doing all of these other things, trying to situate stuff. Him and another deckhand are like trying to get the barges in order. At one point, the barges kind of get the Movilla stuck against the bank. So like there's that to deal with. It's just really confusing, and they have no idea what's going on. Where the crew stood, the crew of the Movilla, was 650 feet away from the broken bridge, and a thick fog made it impossible to see that far. But there was that whoosh and a flicker through the fog and the hissing that deckhands could hear out in the darkness. So you can hear all of this stuff, and just the other senses that you have can pretty easily tell you that, yeah, something is on fire. A radio call in the episode of Forensic Files entitled Visibility Zero recorded a call that went out from the crew of the Movilla at 3:07 a.m. 2 minutes earlier, the Movilla had radioed for help because they were lost. Now the person speaking, who sounds like Captain Stabler with his thick accent. Captain Stabler sounds like his voice is a cross between a Cajun accent and a Southern accent. It's like right in the middle. So it's a little bit of both. And he says, I believe we're at below the train. There's a hell of a fire to be in the middle of the river. His next words are hard to interpret with his accent, but he says he cannot tell where the Movilla is at, adding, quote, it's so foggy I can't tell. Can't tell by looking at the radar, so there's something bad wrong happening up here. Keep in mind, he says this really, really fast in a Southern accent, so a lot of these words are pretty much me going off of what I'm hearing, but he may be saying other stuff. His accent is really nice to hear, but it's also not exactly good for transcripts. The Movilla attempted to move closer to pick up any survivors. It soon became clear that the towboat itself wouldn't be able to get close to the site, given the burning diesel and questionable location of wreckage under the water. So instead, the crew went over in a small boat, grabbing whomever they could out of the river. The crew managed to save 17 people, with other boats and the Coast Guard arriving on the scene as soon as they were able to come and rescue others. The Coast Guard actually had a location that was on, I think it's called Dauphin Island, which is down more near Mobile. And they sent like a little inflatable, like, I think it's the zebra boats, the ones that are inflatables, but they have the engines in the back. Anyway, they sent one of those up with like 3 people just to figure out what was going on. And soon enough, they get, it takes like a half an hour to go up to the spot where the Big Bayou Canot is from there in good weather. So you can imagine what it's like with the fog. And it took actual Coast Guard crews until 4:20 a.m. to get to that spot. The three Coast Guard people who came, the members of the Coast Guard who came to help, they may have gotten there earlier, but it really wasn't until 4:20 that the actual Coast Guard response showed up on the scene. 47 people died and over 100 were injured when the Sunset Limited Amtrak Superline train plummeted into the Big Bayou Canot area of the Mobile River in the early morning hours of September 22nd, 1993. The deceased included 42 passengers and 5 crew members out of a train carrying 220 people when it wrecked. As for the bridge and the train, the total damages would come to $20 million or $45 million today. This was not the first time the bridge across the Big Bayou Canot had been hit by a barge. 14 years earlier, another barge also hit that same bridge. Still, at first, in all of the confusion about the wreck of the train, the involvement of the Movilla was not clear. There were rumors and speculation. It might be terrorism or some kind of sabotage which brought down the bridge. Like, there were a lot of rumors and misinformation going around because, people were just speculating on what could have caused this. Those who arrived on the scene in those early morning hours found train cars scattered around the river like spilled toothpicks. The main engine, the first one to go flying off the bridge, ended up stuck face first in the marsh. Its rear sticking up at a 45-degree angle and the front buried from sight. There were also several of the cars that were in the river that were completely below the water, but there were one or two that were kind of sticking up, and it was just very cluttered and a lot of fire that raged through the area. There was talk of a fireball that had swept through and may have caused the deaths of some of those who were on site. But in general, it was just, it was a mess. It was a complete mess. Following the accident, the cars which had remained on the bridge were towed to the Scott Paper Company on Bay Bridge Road in Mobile. The survivors gathered there as well, stunned and confused after a relief train transported them from the wreck site. When reporters from local news like the Press Register arrived, they were under the impression from earlier reports that it was a freight train which wrecked, not a passenger train. The number of people on the scene at the Scott Paper Company, not to mention the looks on their faces, made it clear the situation was much more serious than first reported. Okay, so we have ourselves an accident. Now we need some investigators. The National Transportation Safety Board sent a team of investigators to Alabama to find out just what went wrong on the Big Bayou Canot that night. The good thing about the Sunset Limited is that, like with aircraft, the Sunset Limited had an event recorder which would keep track of all actions taken. The event recorder made it clear that the Sunset Limited had continued onward along that track, having no idea what was up ahead, and having done nothing itself to cause the accident. The passengers' accounts indicated train companies might need to think about giving those on board safety briefings so they could more easily escape the train in case of an accident. But the crew of the train were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing given the information that was in front of them. They had that green light, they hadn't heard anything over the radio, there was nothing to indicate to them that there was any sort of problem up ahead on the tracks. Once it was clear the problem was with the bridge and not the train, what now needed to be answered was the question of why the bridge collapsed. At first, it was thought that it might have been sabotage. Earlier that year, the World Trade Center had been bombed, killing 6, and almost immediately afterward, the siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas began. The bombing was on the 26th of February, and then 2 days later, the siege on the compound began. So that gives you some idea of what kind of a year it was. A very busy year. Terrorism, foreign and domestic, was on a lot of people's minds. You were still 2 years out from Oklahoma City. You're still 3 years out from the Atlanta Olympics bombing. So in the 90s, there were a few notable cases of terrorist actions, and so it was a possibility that maybe somebody had taken down this bridge for some reason. But there was the question of the Movilla and why it was on the Big Bayou Canot when there was meant to be no water traffic there. Investigators examined the bridge, and then they examined the barges. As Willie Odom stood behind the wheel on the Movilla that night, he couldn't see that front row of barges. Therefore, he didn't see the barge in the front to his left strike one of the cement piers under the support at the northern end of the truss section. So that section that had the trusses over it, at the end of that, it connects with that part in the middle that is open. And the support that is under where those two meet, it hit that cement, like the pier in the water. It hit that. And the markings on the barge made scratches on the support and vice versa. So it matched. It was like a fingerprint, and they matched with one another. When the barge banged into that pier, the other two barges to its right also jostled in the water and bumped against the bridge. The middle barge jerked upward and forward, hitting the middle section of the barge. There was a girder that was right underneath that section, and the barge that was in the middle, it kind of, it gets bumped against, and then it bumps up in the air, and it hits the bottom of that bridge and kind of moves it forward. From where it's looking. Where the train is coming from, it is being moved to the train's left. So it doesn't know it's coming from that direction, and it's going to see train tracks shifted to the left, but it's coming. And so that bump wasn't hard, or didn't feel hard to the people who were on the Movilla, but it was enough to knock that section of the bridge up and over by just over 3 feet. 38 inches to be exact. Understandably, the investigation turned its gaze on Willie Odom, the man at the wheel of the Movilla, when it struck the bridge. Willie Odom didn't have any sort of formal training as a towboat operator, but that wasn't unusual for folks in this particular line of work traveling up and down the Mobile River. You just kind of learn on the job. He did pass the test for his piloting license, over a few short months ago. Only a few short months ago. Something he'd struggled to do. He failed 7 times before finally doing well enough to get that license. So he takes the test 7 times, absolutely fails, gets to that 8th time, and he passes. Yay, he gets his operator's license. So that's great. Now, you'd think that having earned a pilot's license, Odom would be able to do certain things like, say, read the Movilla's radar. But he'd never been trained how to do that. Nobody ever showed him. He had to go off of what he saw in front of him and just kind of, knowing the river, know what he was seeing. But that doesn't always work out. I can tell you, as somebody who spends so much time on Apple Maps looking to follow rivers and things like that, and other things to figure out how to explain to you where they are and how they happened, you can get really lost really fast looking at a map. So there's that. He did have a map of the river, but he'd left it at home on the night of the accident. So he can't read the radar. He doesn't have his map, and he didn't even have a compass on him to help orient himself should the radar fail and the map, fall off the boat somehow. Like, he didn't have, redundancies upon redundancies for how to navigate this boat in the middle of the night on a foggy evening. Like, he had nothing. You'd also think that if the bridge suffered such clear damage because of the barge strike, the damage to the rails would have caused the signal prior to the bridge to turn red. But remember, I said it turned red if a rail was snapped or broken. The rails on the bridges, even after the accident, remained in one piece, simply bent and shifted, but not separated. Seems like being struck by a bunch of barges would be enough to snap a rail, wouldn't you think? Well, that depends on the rail and what you do with it. See, if you're building a rail line, you don't want those rails to break easily. That causes derailments. So what you do is you weld the lines together. This makes them strong and up to the challenge of carrying hundreds of tons of freight and passenger trains for years. This particular bridge, trains would pass over it 20 times a day, so it needed to be able to hold up to that. But it also made them hard to break. And in a situation like this, you needed it to break to warn the train to slow down. While the rails stayed together even after the barge struck, the tracks themselves were a different story. It was quickly discovered that on the plans for the bridge, going all the way back to the turn of the century, like it was 84 years prior to when this happened, that the bridge was built. So I think it was 1909, 1910 we're talking about. The Big Bayou Canot was designed, or the bridge was designed to swing open in the middle to allow ships to pass. Now remember, not when I say swing open, I don't mean like a door where it's on a hinge and the whole thing swings open. I mean that there's a hinge on the bottom, or a little screw on the bottom, a little turn thing on the bottom, where you have the support in the middle of that middle section of the bridge, and when a boat comes along, that middle part twists like if you're turning a doorknob, like that. And so the whole thing is turning as one piece in the middle, so it rotates like the hands on a clock, like that. The support beam under that part of the bridge was under the center of that specific section, so it could twist the other way, perpendicular to the rest of the bridge. Of course, it wasn't actually turned into a swing bridge. It remained still and supposedly solid. They ended up building it as a solid bridge. The bridges at Bayou Sara, the bridge at Mobile River, those two were swing bridges, so that they would open up like that and you could go through. That's why the Mobile Bridge had a tender to keep in touch with boats and those sorts of things and be able to open up so that they could get through. But the bridge at the Big Bayou Canot was not like that. The swing section was located after the trestle section ended. So remember how I described it, that you have these two parts. You have the trestle section is your left hand, you put it flat. The other section in the middle is your right hand, you put it flat. You touch the tips of your middle fingers together, and now you have a flat surface that the train can drive across, and underneath where your fingers meet, that is where that support would be, underneath that point right there. Now, you remember when you were a kid and you played with race cars and you'd have the track, or like a train track, like a toy train track, and they would have things that you would snap together. If it was a nice train track, if it was, the kind that you'd build with your grandpa, or like a little like toddler one, all of them have some sort of snap that you can connect them into place. So while you're driving your train or driving your little race cars across it, you don't pull them apart. The swing section on this bridge didn't interlock with each side for a reason. It was meant to swing. When it was changed to be a solid bridge, the two ends should have been connected to the bridge, so that it wouldn't move. However, because the middle section was meant to swing around to allow boats to pass, that section in the plans which should have been bolted down, was instead resting on the support pillar rather than locked in with bolts. They kind of forgot to do that when they built the bridge. They built the bridge, they started to build it as a swing bridge, but then they stopped or they didn't get to it. But the point is that they were building this bridge, and when they decided to change the way that they were building it, they didn't adapt everything that they were supposed to, like securing that middle section of the bridge. So when the Movilla and the barges that were in front of it nudged that center girder out of position, it didn't need much force. It was holding onto that support pillar with simply some welded rails and 80 years worth of dumb luck. If there had been more traffic on that river and that bridge remained a solid bridge, it would have eventually fallen. Something would have happened. Somebody would have nudged against it with the fog. Over 80 years, something would have happened. But because people didn't go down that river, they weren't supposed to, that didn't happen. The support pillar was basically resting. Where those two fingertips were together, it should have been bolted down on both sides. Bolts in each end. Now, there were bolts on the one side that had the trusses. There weren't on the middle section. And so when the barges nudged it over, it should have stayed in place. But it didn't, because it was basically just sitting there. And when the NTSB sent their bridge guy to examine the bridge and see what was wrong, he looked at that support and you could see scratches in the concrete from that section being nudged over, and no broken bolts that were holding it in or anything like that. So the National Transportation Safety Board's final report on the Big Bayou Canot disaster found several entities responsible for what occurred. As I stated earlier in the episode, the Warrior and Gulf Navigation Company operated the Movilla, and so it was on them to ensure their crews had all of the necessary training to do their jobs. But Willie Odom, who just received his pilot license on the 8th try, didn't even know how to read the radar, a skill that one would think extremely necessary for the pilot of a towboat. Related to that, the NTSB found that the Coast Guard wasn't setting the bar high enough for these towboat pilots. The standards the Coast Guard set for pilots was low enough that pilot Odom, who'd worked hard and tried over and over and over again to get his license, didn't receive enough training to do the job he'd been licensed to do. The NTSB recommended the Coast Guard hook up with towing companies to work out proper guidelines for training pilots on how to use the boat's radar systems. They also stated that the Coast Guard requirements for towboats should include keeping maps and charts on board for navigational use by the crew. Mr. Odom's inability to read the radar meant he couldn't use the one tool most helpful to him as a pilot on a foggy night. He didn't have a map or compass, so the only things he could use to orient himself and the Movilla were his own eyes and what he could piece together through the fog. He could have stopped the Movilla and its flotilla of barges at the edge of the river, but he made the fatal decision to continue onward until he could find a suitable place to secure the towboat and the barges at the side of the river. Through the fog and the dark, the blurred silhouette of the bridge may have looked to pilot Odom like something on the river banks to which he could tie off the Movilla. So it was just a bad decision on his part that he could not in a million years have seen that ending coming. As for Amtrak, the NTSB report recommended that the company make an effort to give their passengers the same sort of safety demonstrations given on airplanes. This way, in the case of a derailment or fire or any other sort of rail accident, passengers could be better equipped to safely and quickly evacuate the train. 6 months after the wreck, District Attorney Chris Galanos announced a task force investigating the accident could find no criminal liability with which to charge anyone. The task force looked into whether manslaughter or negligent homicide charges might be possible for Willie Odom, for the railroad company, for the company which owned the Movilla, all of them. Odom had already given up his pilot's license voluntarily, preventing himself from having to go through a hearing led by the Coast Guard. Credit where credit is due. Odom appeared, as far as I can tell, to be genuinely remorseful about everything that happened, and to kind of stand up and go, no, you're right, man. I'm not going to fight this. Here you go. Here's my license. I do not deserve that. You can just take that back. These days, you can still take the Sunset Limited, although now, if you look it up, you'll find it stops in New Orleans instead of Florida. Service between there was suspended following the destruction caused by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I don't know if it picked back up again, but I do know that if you look at it now, it just says that you can go from California to New Orleans, which makes me really tempted to do that. When I checked this afternoon to see how much the trip would run you, you could leave on Halloween night from Los Angeles at 10 p.m. for $246 for a coach seat, or $1,167 for a sleeper. The ride would take you 1 day, 22 hours, and 40 minutes, and during that time, you can take in the natural beauty of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and New Orleans. A memorial to the wreck of the Sunset Limited sits on the western bank of the Big Bayou Canot, just north of the bridge which the speeding train careened off of 3 decades ago. The memorial, a simple square plaque on a marble base, features a long paragraph detailing the events of that horrible night on the Big Bayou Canot. It mentions that CSX Transportation rebuilt the bridge and got traffic moving across it once again in only 7 days. The inscription ends with, quote, "May this monument forever remind us of our responsibilities to our fellow man in the routine of our daily work and in the extraordinary events that shape our lives." End quote. Yeah, so thankfully I got that done by the end of the day. I'm really proud of myself. It's a difficult time right now, kind of worried about a lot of people and about, how they're doing. You know what's going on in the United States. I have friends who are dealing with the loss of possible benefits and this sort of thing, and looking forward to not being able to like eat this week, which that's great. I say very sarcastically, but it's just so like, I have a really hard time reading about train wrecks and researching train wrecks, because most of the time I'm sitting there looking at this, especially in the United States, looking at them and going, we could have it so much better. We just have to fix everything, update everything, have such nice trains. Apparently we can't have anything right now, so I don't know why I want trains, but I do. I want so many trains. I want nice, fast, speedy trains and a really good rail system and just high-speed rail and all sorts of great things. And we don't get to have anything, so that's great. Some of us get a little something. I have books and my record collection and my dog. That's about it. That's all I get. That's literally all I get. It's just my dog, which is enough, and my record collection, which is up to 60 now. Yay. And my books, which I will get to read eventually. One of these days. But, yeah. So, that is the Big Bayou Canot wreck. I actually remember watching the Seconds from Disaster episode on this, like, 20 years ago. That's how long ago that episode came out. I think it was like, it was close to like, 2000. It was a while ago when that came out. So yeah, I can remember watching the episode when it just came out. I did not know that there was an episode of Forensic Files about this, which is pretty cool. But yeah, it's there's a lot of stuff going on, and so this was actually this is pretty awful, this wreck. But yeah, 47 deceased, all of that. But at the same time, at the end, I kind of had the opportunity to look at train rides and how much they might cost, and if you wanted to go on a train trip across the country right now, would you be able to do it, and how much would it run you? And God, I would love to do that. That I want to just sit in a rail car and let somebody else drive me across the country, so I'm close to the ground and I can see everything. That's what I want to do one of these days when I can afford it. Actually, there's a very nice one that goes across Canada, I think, and if I remember correctly, it costs something like $12,000, which, yes, can I do that, please? Somebody buy me a trip on a train. I want to go and experience things, and I can't really do that right now or at this point ever, the way we're going. But yeah. Oh, so how's everybody else doing? I am tired. I have to go to work in an hour at my weekend job. And I've had to work at dog camp this week. And fortunately, it's been a little slower, so I haven't had to work as much. But, yeah, I'm still tired. We're all tired. I think we all need to take a deep breath. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. Just relax. Move your shoulders. Did you take your meds? Did you drink your water? Are we all taken care of? Do you have a snack? When was the last time you ate? Go do something that will make you feel better. Double check and make sure you've had everything you need to have. Water, food, meds, anything else that you need to have. If do you need some candy? Go get some candy. Go get something. Whatever you need to kind of perk yourself up a little bit, feel a little better. Go hug your dog or your cat or whatever other animal we have. It's really difficult right now. It's Halloween. It is my favorite holiday. I should not be the least bit unhappy or stressed out. I love Halloween. And I would really like to continue loving Halloween. So I am going to spend the next hour trying to enjoy what I can of Halloween. Basically, that just means eating little Hershey bars and Nerds boxes until I just have to run out the door for work. Oh, I need a nap. Okay. Thank you guys. And until next time, stay safe.